My name is Maria Santos, and 3 years ago, I was just another server at Tony's Roadhouse in Tucson, Arizona. At 24, I'd been slinging burgers and coffee to truckers and college kids for 6 years, saving every penny I could while living in a cramped studio apartment above the laundromat. Most people saw me as just another short Latina girl with big dreams and small prospects. 5'1", soft-spoken, with calloused hands from years of carrying heavy trays and cleaning tables until closing time. What they didn't know was that every Sunday morning, I drove 2 hours into the Sonoran Desert to an abandoned mining site where my grandfather had taught me something extraordinary. Roberto Santos had been a Marine sniper in Vietnam, and after my parents died in a car accident when I was 12, he'd raised me on stories of precision, discipline, and never backing down from a fight. The rifle case in my Honda Civic's trunk held his old Remington 700, and tucked beside it was his Purple Heart medal, the only thing I had left of him after he passed 2 years ago. The idea to try for Army Special Forces came from a recruitment video I saw during a commercial break at work. The narrator spoke about finding warriors in unexpected places, about recognizing talent that didn't fit traditional molds. That night, I held Grandpa's Purple Heart and felt something stir inside me that I'd never acknowledged before. The feeling that maybe, just maybe, I was meant for something bigger than serving coffee and pretending to laugh at customers' crude jokes. The decision to leave Arizona required me to drain my savings account. $3,200 earned through double shifts and skipped meals. I bought a Greyhound ticket to North Carolina and packed everything I owned into 2 duffel bags. The journey to Fort Bragg took 38 hours through endless highways and forgotten towns. But I spent the time remembering Grandpa's lessons. Precision isn't about the gun, Major. It's about becoming so still inside that the whole world holds its breath with you. Walking into the Special Forces Assessment and Selection Facility felt like entering another universe. Fort Bragg hummed with testosterone and confidence, filled with candidates who looked like they'd been carved from marble. My second-hand jeans, worn sneakers, and duct-taped duffel bag marked me as clearly as wearing a neon sign reading "Doesn't belong here." But I was here, and I wasn't leaving without proving myself. The first person I encountered was Staff Sergeant James Mitchell, a mountain of a man with arms like tree trunks and a chest full of ribbons. He looked at me like I'd wandered into the wrong building by mistake. "Miss Santos, is it?" His voice carried the authority of someone who'd never been questioned. "The Civilian Employment Office is in Building D. Kitchen staff reports there." "No, Sergeant. I'm here for SFAR selection." The silence that followed was deafening. 3 massive candidates nearby stopped their conversation to stare, and I heard one of them, a guy named Jackson with Harvard written all over his posture, mutter to his buddy, "Did the cleaning lady just say Special Forces?" Mitchell's laugh was worse than any insult. "Young lady, this isn't summer camp. This is the most demanding military selection process in the world. We require candidates who can carry their own weight and everyone else's when necessary." His eyes lingered on my small frame with the kind of disgust usually reserved for spoiled food. But something in his dismissive tone reminded me of every person who'd ever underestimated me, every customer who'd assumed I was too stupid to understand their conversation, every person who'd looked right through me like I was invisible. I felt Grandpa's Purple Heart grow warm in my pocket, and I heard his voice across the ears. "Champions aren't born, Major. They're revealed under pressure." The briefing session that followed was designed to break spirits before real testing even began. Captain Rachel Morrison, the base's top female officer and poster child for military excellence, read through candidate credentials with theatrical precision. Her voice took on different tones depending on the impressiveness of each resume. Harvard Law School former Army Ranger, Stanford MBA, Marine Force Recon, Georgetown International Relations, Navy SEAL. Then her voice shifted, dripping with barely concealed mockery. "And Maria Santos, high school diploma, restaurant server from Tucson, Arizona." The room erupted in barely contained laughter. Jackson slapped his knee and declared, Did she bring her order pad? Another voice added, hope she can take our coffee orders after she washes out. Each joke hit me like a physical blow, calculated to make me question my sanity for being there. But I'd survived 6 years of drunk customers, grabby truckers, and condescending college kids. I could survive this. Staff Sergeant Mitchell seized the moment to make an example of me. Miss Santos, can you explain your qualifications for the world's most demanding military selection process? What advanced tactical training do you possess? What combat experience? What classified operations have you participated in? His questions came like bullets, each designed to expose my inadequacy in front of an audience that had already judged me. I felt heat crawl up my neck like wildfire, but my voice remained steady. I don't have formal military training, Sergeant, but my grandfather taught me. Your grandfather? Captain Morrison interrupted with theatrical surprise. Was Grandpa a Special Forces commander? A Special Operations legend, perhaps? He was a Marine sniper in Vietnam, ma'am. Ah, so this is about living out Grandpa's war stories. How quaint. Morrison's smile was razor-sharp as the room buzzed with cruel amusement. I could feel 60 pairs of eyes on me, could hear the whispered comments floating through the crowd like poison gas. This is better than reality TV. 20 BX says she quits before lunch. Someone should call security before she hurts herself. The physical assessment began immediately after the briefing, and it was designed to break spirits as much as test bodies. I struggled through pull-ups, completing 6 when the male minimum was 12. During the obstacle course, my smaller stature forced me to find creative solutions that drew fresh mockery from candidates who seemed to take pleasure in watching someone struggle. Look at her go, Jackson commented loudly, his voice carrying across the training ground like a bullhorn. Like a little gymnast trying to keep up with real soldiers. When I finished the course 2 minutes slower than the cutoff time, Mitchell announced to the entire group. Some people mistake determination for delusion. The words stung worse than any physical pain I'd endured. The equipment fitting session provided another opportunity for systematic humiliation. The standard tactical gear dwarfed my frame like a child playing dress-up. The helmet slid over my eyes despite multiple adjustments, the vest hung loosely despite the tightest settings, and the boots looked comically oversized. Maybe we should check the children's department, Morrison suggested, earning fresh waves of laughter that echoed off the walls like breaking glass. But it was the classroom sessions that cut deepest. While other candidates discussed advanced tactical concepts using precise military terminology learned in war colleges, my contribution sounded elementary by comparison. When asked about urban warfare strategies, I described approaches learned from hunting in the Arizona desert. Answers that revealed the vast gap between my background and theirs. Miss Santos's strategy appears to be based on nature documentaries, Mitchell drawled, his voice dripping with sarcasm. How do you plan to apply rabbit hunting techniques to counter-terrorism operations? Even when my answers showed genuine insight, they were dismissed without consideration. My observation about wind patterns affecting long-distance accuracy was brushed aside with Morrison's cutting remark. We're looking for soldiers, not weather girls. By the end of the first day, I was completely isolated. Other candidates formed natural alliances based on shared military experience, while I ate alone, trained alone, and endured whispered conversations that stopped whenever I approached. During team exercises, I was consistently picked last, treated as dead weight by whichever group was forced to include me. Just try not to get us all killed, one teammate muttered during a simulated combat scenario, his words carrying the weight of assumed incompetence that followed me like a shadow. By the third day, the systematic campaign to break my spirits had evolved into something approaching psychological warfare. What had begun as casual mockery transformed into calculated cruelty designed to make me quit voluntarily and spare everyone the embarrassment of my inevitable failure. The whispered conversations followed me everywhere like a toxic cloud. In the mess hall, at the supply depot during briefings, everywhere I went, Voices would drop to conspiratorial whispers that stopped the moment I approached. I caught fragments, completely delusional, wasting everyone's time. Someone should talk to her before she embarrasses herself further. Jackson had appointed himself the unofficial spokesperson for group sentiment. During a tactical planning exercise, he made sure his voice carried when he told another candidate, "We need to be realistic about team composition. Some people are going to be liabilities in actual combat situations." His eyes found mine across the room. Dead weight gets people killed. The instructors weren't much better. Master Sergeant Davis, who ran combat simulations, had taken to using me as a negative example during debriefings. "Santos, explain your decision-making process during the hostage rescue scenario." When I described my approach, he'd shake his head with exaggerated disappointment. That's exactly the kind of thinking that gets hostages killed and operators captured. Captain Morrison seemed to take particular pleasure in highlighting my failures. During equipment checks, she'd always find something wrong with my gear that somehow escaped notice on other candidates. "Santos, your weapon maintenance is substandard. In the field, a dirty rifle means dead soldiers." She'd hold up my spotlessly clean M4 and point to imaginary flaws that required public correction and reinspection. The breaking point of social isolation came during a team-building exercise designed to forge bonds between future operators. We were divided into 6-person teams for a 72-hour field training exercise in the North Carolina wilderness. I was assigned to Team Bravo, led by a former Marine captain named Thompson, who made his feelings clear from the start. "Look, Santos, I'll be straight with you. Nobody wants you here, but we're stuck with each other for 3 days. Stay out of the way, follow orders without question, and maybe we'll all get through this without incident." His tone suggested that any incident would automatically be my fault. The other team members, Williams from Navy Special Warfare, Rodriguez from Army Rangers, Chen from Air Force Pararescue, and Martinez from Marine Force Recon, nodded agreement. I was the weak link, the charity case, the diversity hire who was going to get everyone else in trouble. During the exercise, they assigned me the most menial tasks while excluding me from actual tactical planning. I carried extra gear, prepared meals, and maintained equipment while they conducted real soldier work. When we encountered other teams during training scenarios, I could see the looks of confusion and barely suppressed laughter as they tried to figure out what I was doing there. "Is that your mascot?" a candidate from Team Alpha asked Thompson, pointing at me while I set up our camp's perimeter security. "Something like that," Thompson replied, not bothering to lower his voice. "Command's new diversity initiative. We're supposed to pretend she belongs here." The nights were the worst part. While the others shared stories from their military experience, swapped contacts for future assignments, and bonded over shared understanding of military culture, I lay in my sleeping bag listening to conversations I couldn't join. They talked about deployments I'd never had, training schools I'd never attended, and a brotherhood I'd never be part of. On the second night, I overheard Williams talking to Rodriguez about me. "It's actually kind of sad, you know? She probably thinks she has a chance. Someone should explain reality to her before this gets worse." "Not our job," Rodriguez replied. "She'll figure it out when she washes out with the rest of the wannabes." But it was Chen who delivered the cruelest assessment. The really messed up part is that she's taking a spot that could have gone to someone qualified. Some Marine or soldier who actually deserves to be here is sitting at home because they gave her slot to check a diversity box. I pressed my face into my sleeping bag to muffle any sound that might escape, feeling smaller and more alone than I'd ever felt in my life. Even during the worst days at the restaurant, when customers treated me like I was invisible or stupid, I'd had the dignity of earning my place through honest work. Here I was seen as charity case, an affirmative action mistake that was insulting everyone else's legitimate achievements. The final day of the exercise brought a navigation and marksmanship test that would determine team rankings. Each team member had to successfully navigate to 5 checkpoint locations and engage targets at various distances. My teammates made their expectations clear. Stay in the back, don't slow anyone down, and try not to embarrass the entire team when my turn came. We reached the first checkpoint without incident, but at the second location, Williams missed his target at 400 meters, a shot that should have been routine for someone with his background. "Damn wind," he muttered, making his excuse before anyone could comment. Rodriguez missed at 600 meters. "Scope's off," he announced, though there had been no opportunity for the scope to shift during our careful movement. By the fourth checkpoint, Chen and Martinez had both failed to hit targets that were well within their supposed skill range. Thompson was growing increasingly frustrated as our team's ranking plummeted with each missed shot. "Santos," he finally said, his voice tight with barely controlled anger, "you're up." The target sat 800 meters away, a distance that had defeated half the candidates I'd watched attempt it. The wind was gusting from multiple directions. Visibility was poor due to afternoon heat shimmer, and I was using an unfamiliar rifle with a scope I'd never zeroed. I closed my eyes and let myself remember Grandpa's lessons, feeling the familiar calm settle over me like coming home. When I opened them, the noise of my teammates' expectations faded to background static. There was only the target, the wind, and the space between heartbeats where perfect shots lived. The rifle bucked against my shoulder with authority, and through the scope, I watched the bullet find its mark dead center. Then I shifted to the next target at 900 meters and repeated the process. 5 shots, 5 perfect hits at distances that had broken more experienced shooters throughout the day. The silence that followed was different from the mocking quiet I'd grown accustomed to. This was the silence of people processing something they hadn't expected to see, trying to reconcile what had just happened with everything they believed about my capabilities. Thompson was the first to speak, his voice carefully neutral. "Good shooting, Santos." But I could see the questions in all their eyes, the same confusion I'd noticed whenever something I did didn't match their preconceptions. Rather than pride or recognition, there was almost resentment, as if my success somehow diminished their own abilities or threatened the natural order they'd established. The ride back to base was uncomfortably quiet, filled with the kind of tension that comes when people realize they might have been wrong about something important, but aren't ready to admit it yet. The final week of SFAS arrived with the weight of inevitability, like watching a slow-motion car crash that everyone knew was coming but no one could prevent. The remaining 43 candidates had been whittled down from an original class of 97, and the pressure had transformed from difficult to suffocating. Sleep deprivation, physical exhaustion, and psychological stress had pushed everyone to their breaking points, some more obviously than others. I'd made it further than anyone had expected, including myself, but the constant isolation and daily humiliation had worn me down to raw nerve endings. Every morning brought fresh opportunities for public embarrassment, every meal was eaten alone while surrounded by people, and every night ended with the certainty that tomorrow would bring new reasons to question my sanity for being there. The breaking point came during what should have been a routine psychological evaluation, a standard interview designed to assess mental toughness and stability under pressure. I was scheduled to meet with Dr. Patricia Hendricks, the base psychologist, in her sterile office that smelled of coffee and institutional disinfectant. Dr. Hendricks was a thin woman in her 50s with sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and the kind of clinical demeanor that made it impossible to tell whether she was trying to help you or dissect you. She'd been evaluating Special Forces candidates for over a decade, and her recommendations carried significant weight in determining who advanced and who went home. "Miss Santos," she began, her voice carefully neutral as she reviewed my file, "I've been observing your integration with the other candidates, and I have some concerns about your psychological fitness for this program." The words hit me like ice water. After surviving everything they'd thrown at me physically, the possibility that I might be eliminated for mental health reasons felt like the ultimate insult. "Ma'am, I feel mentally prepared for whatever challenges." That's exactly what concerns me, she interrupted, making notes on her pad without looking up. Your persistence in the face of clear social rejection suggests possible delusional thinking. The other candidates have made it obvious that you don't fit in here, yet you continue to pursue something that's clearly causing you significant psychological distress. I felt my hands clench involuntarily. With respect, ma'am, I'm here because I belong here. Not because I need social approval from people who've never given me a fair chance. Dr. Hendricks looked up then, her expression shifting to something approaching pity. Maria, may I call you Maria? Sometimes the kindest thing we can do for someone is help them recognize their limitations before they cause themselves additional harm. Your background, your physical stature, your lack of military experience. These aren't personal failings. They're simply indicators that this path isn't right for you. The patronizing tone was worse than outright hostility. She was trying to counsel me out of the program for my own good. Like a parent explaining to a child why they couldn't have a pony. The assumption that I was too fragile, too delusional, too pathetic to handle rejection made my vision blur with rage. Furthermore, she continued, your isolation from the group dynamic raises serious questions about your ability to function as part of a team in high-stress situations. Special Forces operators must be able to build instant rapport and trust with their teammates. Your social difficulties here suggest you might be a liability in actual combat situations. That was the moment something inside me snapped. Not the explosive anger that leads to shouting matches or dramatic exits, but the cold, crystalline fury that comes when someone has finally pushed too far. I stood up slowly, my voice deadly quiet. Dr. Hendricks, I've been patient with the hazing, the jokes, and the systematic exclusion because I understood that was part of the process. But I won't sit here and let you pathologize my determination as mental illness because it's inconvenient for everyone that I haven't quit yet. She blinked, clearly not used to candidates pushing back during psychological evaluations. Miss Santos, I think you're misunderstanding my... No, ma'am, I understand perfectly. You want me to voluntarily eliminate myself so you don't have to officially fail me and deal with the paperwork. You want me to agree that I'm delusional, unstable, and unfit so everyone can go back to their comfortable assumptions about who belongs in Special Forces and who doesn't. Dr. Hendricks's pen stopped moving. For the first time since I'd entered her office, she looked genuinely surprised by something I'd said. The truth is, I continued, my voice gaining strength, I've outperformed half these candidates in every measurable skill, except the politics of fitting in with people who decided I was a joke before I even opened my mouth. My marksmanship scores are in the top 5%, my navigation and land nav scores are above average, and I've completed every physical challenge despite being smaller than everyone else here. Miss Santos, I'm not finished. The words came out sharper than I'd intended, but I was past caring about military courtesy or psychological evaluation protocols. You want to talk about team dynamics? Let me tell you about team dynamics. I've been excluded from every informal gathering, ignored during tactical discussions, and treated like a mascot instead of a teammate. But somehow my failure to integrate with people who refuse to acknowledge my existence is evidence of my psychological unfitness. Dr. Hendricks was writing furiously now, probably documenting my aggressive outburst for the official record, but I was beyond caring about consequences. Here's what's really happening, ma'am. You've all decided that someone like me doesn't belong here, and every day I don't quit is an embarrassment to that decision. So now we're moving from physical challenges I can meet to psychological evaluations where the standards are completely subjective and can be adjusted to reach predetermined conclusions. I reached into my pocket and pulled out Grandpa's Purple Heart, setting it on her desk between us. The medal caught the fluorescent light like a small beacon. My grandfather earned this in Vietnam as a Marine sniper. He came home to people spitting on his uniform and calling him a baby killer. He could have been bitter, could have given up on serving something bigger than himself. Instead, he taught his granddaughter that excellence speaks louder than prejudice, and that the only opinion that matters is the one you have of yourself when you look in the mirror. Dr. Hendricks stared at the Purple Heart, her clinical composure finally cracking slightly. "So here's what's going to happen," I said, standing to leave. "You can write whatever you want in your evaluation. You can recommend me for psychological discharge, personality disorder, or whatever diagnosis makes everyone feel better about wanting me gone. But I'm not quitting. I'm not agreeing that I'm mentally unfit. And I'm not making this easy for anyone." I picked up the Purple Heart and headed for the door, then turned back for one final statement. "And ma'am, when I prove everyone wrong, and I will prove everyone wrong, I hope you remember this conversation and ask yourself whether the problem was my psychological fitness or your professional judgment." The door closed behind me with a soft click that sounded like a gunshot in the sterile hallway. I just committed career suicide, challenging a military psychologist during an official evaluation, but I felt more alive than I had in weeks. 3 hours later, Staff Sergeant Mitchell found me in the barracks cleaning my rifle with a mechanical precision that always calmed my nerves. His expression was unreadable, but the official envelope in his hand told me everything I needed to know. "Santos, report to the commander's office at 800 tomorrow for final evaluation and discharge processing." I'd made it 26 days into a program designed to last 6 weeks, further than anyone had expected but not far enough to matter. The elimination was inevitable, predictable, and completely unfair, which somehow made it hurt worse than if I'd simply failed a physical standard or tactical exercise. That night, I lay in my bunk listening to the breathing of candidates who would continue their journey toward becoming Special Forces operators while I packed my bags for the trip home to serving coffee and pretending my dreams had been realistic. The familiar weight of Grandpa's Purple Heart in my palm felt like both an anchor and a promise. A reminder that sometimes the most important battles are fought not for victory, but for the right to prove you belonged in the fight at all. The final evaluation was scheduled for 800, but I woke up at 500 with the restless energy that comes from knowing your fate is sealed. Rather than lie in bed replaying every moment that had led to this inevitable conclusion, I decided to take one last walk around Fort Bragg before my military dreams officially ended. The base was quiet in the pre-dawn darkness, with only the occasional security patrol and early rising personnel moving through the shadows. I found myself drawn to the advanced marksmanship range, where the final shooting assessment would take place later that week, a test I'd never get to attempt. The range was deserted except for one figure: Chief Warrant Officer Linda Patterson, the senior marksmanship instructor whose legend preceded her throughout the military. At 52, she was the kind of woman who'd fought her own battles against discrimination and won through sheer competence and an unwillingness to accept limitations imposed by others. "You're up early, Santos," she said without turning around as she adjusted targets at the 800-meter line. "Shouldn't you be packing for your trip home?" The question stung, but her tone was neutral, curious rather than mocking. "Couldn't sleep, ma'am. Figured I'd take one last look at the range before I leave." Chief Patterson finally turned to face me, her weathered features impossible to read in the dim light. "Mind if I ask you something?" "No, ma'am." "Why are you really here?" The question caught me off guard. After weeks of people assuming they knew my motivations, daddy issues, diversity quotas, delusional thinking, someone was actually asking what drove me. "Because I'm good at this, ma'am. Better than anyone wants to admit." I pulled out Grandpa's Purple Heart and held it up so she could see. "My grandfather taught me that excellence is the only argument that matters, and I've never had the chance to make that argument at the level I'm capable of." Chief Patterson studied the medal for a long moment, then looked back at me with something approaching respect. "Roberto Santos, Vietnam, 1968 to 1969. Confirmed kills at distances exceeding 1,000 meters with equipment that would be considered primitive by today's standards." My jaw dropped. "You knew my grandfather?" "Not personally, but I know the records. I've studied every American military sniper of the past 50 years. Your grandfather's work in the Ashar Valley is still used as a case study in precision shooting under extreme conditions." She paused, her expression shifting to something approaching anger. "Which makes what's happening to you even more insulting. Ma'am? Santos, how many people have bothered to ask about your actual shooting experience before deciding you don't belong here?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a discharged weapon. "None, ma'am." "That's what I thought." Chief Patterson walked over to her equipment case and pulled out a folder thick with documentation. "I've been watching the selection class, and what I've seen has made me sick to my stomach. Qualified candidates being dismissed based on appearance, background, or politics instead of ability." She opened the folder and spread out several documents on the equipment table. "Do you know what the original Special Forces selection criteria were when the program was established?" "No, ma'am." Exceptional ability in any core competency could override deficiencies in other areas. Marksmanship was always considered the primary core competency because it's the one skill that can't be faked, taught quickly, or compensated for by teamwork. Her voice carried the weight of institutional knowledge earned through decades of service. "The problem is that over the years, the focus shifted from ability to conformity. Instead of finding the best shooters, tacticians, and warriors, we started selecting people who looked like what we thought soldiers should look like." She pulled out a specific document and handed it to me. "This is the regulation that's been conveniently forgotten by most selection committees. Any candidate who achieves a new range record during official testing hours must be reconsidered for selection regardless of other evaluation criteria." I stared at the document, reading the words but not quite processing their implications. "Ma'am, I don't understand. The final marksmanship assessment isn't just a graduation requirement. It's an opportunity for extraordinary candidates to prove they belong here, despite what anyone else thinks." Chief Patterson's smile was sharp as a blade. "The current range record is held by Captain Morrison herself. 847 out of 1,000 possible points at distances up to 1,200 meters." The pieces started falling into place. "Are you saying?" "I'm saying that if someone were to attempt the range record during official testing hours and succeed, the selection board would be required by regulation to reconsider their candidacy." She closed the folder and looked at me directly. "The question is whether you're as good as your grandfather's granddaughter should be." The challenge in her voice reminded me of every lesson Grandpa had taught me, every hour we'd spent in the Arizona desert perfecting fundamentals that most people never bothered to learn. I thought about the Purple Heart in my pocket, the legacy I carried, and the opportunity that was being offered. "Chief Patterson, if I were to attempt this record, what would happen to you?" Her laugh was sharp and knowing. "Santos, I'm 3 years from retirement with more commendations than I can count and friends in every corner of this military. The question isn't what happens to me. It's what happens to a system that's been ignoring talent because it doesn't fit their preconceptions." She started packing up her equipment with military precision. "The final assessment begins at 900. If someone were to show up at 800 and request to attempt the range record under official observation, I'd be required by regulation to allow it." She paused and looked at me one more time. "But only if that someone was absolutely certain they could back up their confidence with performance." As she walked away, she called back over her shoulder. "By the way, Santos, your grandfather's longest confirmed kill was 1,347 meters with a rifle that couldn't hold a candle to what's available today. Makes you wonder what his granddaughter might be capable of with proper equipment." I stood alone on the range as the sun began to rise over Fort Bragg, holding my grandfather's Purple Heart and feeling something shift inside me like tectonic plates, finding new alignment. The familiar calm that always preceded my best shooting began to settle over me, and I could almost hear Grandpa's voice across the years. "Champions aren't born, Major. They're revealed under pressure." At 7:45, I walked into the range master's office and formally requested to attempt the standing range record under official observation. Chief Patterson's expression remained professionally neutral, but I caught the slight nod of approval as she began the paperwork that would change everything. Within minutes, word had spread through the base like wildfire. The waitress, who was supposed to be packing her bags, had instead requested to attempt the impossible, and suddenly everyone wanted to witness what they expected to be the most spectacular failure in SFA's history. By 8:30, the advanced marksmanship range had transformed from a quiet morning training area into something resembling a gladiatorial arena. Word of my record attempt had spread through Fort Bragg like wildfire, drawing spectators who'd come to witness what they expected to be either spectacular failure or unprecedented upset. Staff Sergeant Mitchell arrived looking like a man who discovered his worst nightmare was coming true. Behind him came Captain Morrison, her face pale as she realized her 4-year record was about to be challenged by the very candidate she'd spent weeks systematically humiliating. The irony wasn't lost on anyone present. The remaining SFA's candidates clustered together near the observation area. Their conversations a mixture of anticipation and barely concealed mockery. Jackson was running a betting pool with odds heavily favored toward my complete embarrassment. 20 says she doesn't hit the 400-meter target, he announced loudly enough for everyone to hear. 50 says she quits after the first miss. Thompson, my former team leader, was more philosophical in his cruelty. This is actually kind of sad. Someone should have talked her out of this before she embarrasses herself in front of the entire base. But I noticed other faces in the crowd, faces I didn't recognize from the SFA's program. Word had reached beyond our selection class, drawing instructors, administrators, and senior enlisted personnel who'd heard about the unusual record attempt. Among them was Colonel Patricia Hayes, the base commander, whose presence made this officially significant rather than just entertainment. Chief Patterson approached me with the equipment I'd requested. A military-grade sniper rifle with precision optics, match-grade ammunition, and all the tools necessary to either make history or confirm everyone's worst expectations about my capabilities. Santos, she said quietly, her voice carrying only far enough for me to hear, everything you need is here. The rifle is zeroed, the ammunition is consistent, and the conditions are as good as they're going to get. She paused, studying my face for signs of nervousness or doubt. The question is whether you're ready to prove what you've been claiming all along. I accepted the rifle and felt its familiar weight settle into my hands like coming home. The balance was different from Grandpa's old Remington, but the fundamentals remained the same. Breathing, sight alignment, trigger control, and the space between heartbeats where perfect shots lived. The first target sat at 300 meters, a warm-up distance that should have been routine for anyone attempting a range record. But with 60 pairs of eyes watching my every movement, routine felt anything but simple. I could hear whispered comments floating through the morning air like poison gas. Look how she's shaking. This is going to be over fast. Someone should have stopped this before it started. I closed my eyes and let myself travel back in time to the Arizona desert, where Grandpa had taught me everything that mattered. I was 14 again, standing on rocky ground with his Purple Heart catching sunlight beside us, learning that shooting wasn't about the gun, but about becoming so still inside that the whole world held its breath with you. The first shot rang out across Fort Bragg like thunder announcing a storm. Through the spotting scope, Chief Patterson confirmed what I already knew: dead center, no adjustment needed. The whispered commentary shifted slightly. Lucky shot. Let's see her do that again. One hit doesn't mean anything. Target 2 at 450 meters required compensation for wind drift and elevation changes. I made the calculations automatically, processing variables Grandpa had drilled into my mind until they became as natural as breathing. Another perfect hit that sent a murmur of surprise through the watching crowd. By the time I reached the 600-meter targets, the range had grown noticeably quieter. The easy mockery was being replaced by something approaching attention as people began to process that this might not unfold the way they'd expected. Captain Morrison stood directly behind me now, her confident swagger replaced by something approaching concern as she watched her record come under serious threat. Staff Sergeant Mitchell checked and rechecked his spotting scope, as if hoping to find errors that weren't there. Target 7 sat at 800 meters, the distance where many experienced snipers began to struggle with the complex mathematics of long-range shooting. Wind speed, air density, bullet velocity, and Earth rotation all became factors that could turn perfect shots into embarrassing misses. I could feel the pressure of expectation bearing down like atmospheric weight. Could hear the collective-held breath of people who'd written me off, but were now forced to pay attention. This was the moment where I either proved everything I'd claimed about myself or confirmed their worst assumptions about delusional thinking and misplaced confidence. The shot echoed across the North Carolina landscape like a declaration of war against doubt itself. Perfect hit. The silence that followed was different from the mocking quiet I'd grown accustomed to. This was the silence of people processing something they hadn't expected to see, trying to reconcile what was happening with everything they believed about who I was and what I was capable of achieving. Jackson's betting pool had gone completely quiet. Thompson wasn't making any more philosophical observations about my psychological state. Even the senior officers were leaning forward with genuine interest rather than bemused expectation. Target 9 sat at 1,000 meters, a distance that separated competent shooters from genuine artists. The wind was gusting from multiple directions, visibility was affected by heat shimmer, and I was shooting a rifle I'd only handled for 30 minutes. Everything that could go wrong with a shot at this distance was stacking against me. I adjusted for windage and elevation, feeling the familiar calm settle over me like armor against doubt. The target looked impossibly small through the scope, barely larger than a pinhead held at arm's length. But Grandpapa's voice echoed across the years. Distance is just another variable, measure. Master the fundamentals, and the distance becomes irrelevant. The rifle bucked against my shoulder with authority, and through the spotting scope, Chief Patterson's voice cut through the tension. Dead center. New personal best for candidate Santos. The crowd's reaction was a mixture of genuine surprise and grudging acknowledgement. These weren't lucky shots anymore. This was systematic demonstration of skill that couldn't be dismissed or explained away. Target 10 represented the current range record. 1,200 meters, the distance where Captain Morrison had established her legendary score 4 years earlier. Missing this target would still leave me with an impressive performance, but hitting it would tie the existing record and force an official reconsideration of my candidacy. Captain Morrison stepped forward, her voice carrying clearly across the range. Santos, you've already proven your point. No one questions your shooting ability now. Maybe we should, ma'am, I interrupted, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins. I didn't come here to prove a point. I came here to set a new standard. The words hung in the air like smoke from a discharged weapon. I wasn't just attempting to tie her record, I was planning to surpass it entirely. Chief Patterson approached with a range card showing distances beyond anything that had been attempted during officials' fast testing. Santos, the regulation allows record attempts at any distance up to the range's maximum capability. That target, she pointed to a barely visible speck at the far end of the range, sits at 1,400 meters. No one in SFAR's history has even attempted it. The mathematics were staggering. At that distance, I'd be shooting nearly a mile, compensating for wind drift that could push the bullet several feet off target, elevation changes that required precise calculation, and atmospheric conditions that could turn perfect shots into complete misses. Colonel Hayes stepped forward, her authoritative presence commanding attention from everyone present. Miss Santos, are you certain you want to attempt this? The existing record is already an exceptional achievement that would guarantee your reconsideration for the program. I looked around at the faces surrounding me, some hopeful, others skeptical, many simply curious about whether I could back up the confidence I'd been displaying. but the only opinion that mattered was my own, and the promise I'd made to my grandfather's memory. Yes, ma'am. I'm certain. The target at 1,400 meters was barely visible, even through the high-powered scope. A tiny circle that represented everything I'd been working toward since leaving Arizona. This wasn't just about making the shot. It was about proving that excellence has no predetermined face, no required background, no traditional path. I settled into position and began the complex calculations required for extreme long-range shooting. Wind speed and direction at multiple points along the bullet's trajectory. Barometric pressure and humidity affecting air density. Temperature variations that would impact bullet velocity. Even the Coriolis effect caused by Earth's rotation became a factor at this distance. But beneath all the mathematics was something simpler and more fundamental. The lessons Grandpa had taught me about becoming so still inside that the whole world held its breath with you. The technical knowledge mattered, but the spiritual component, the absolute certainty that the shot would find its mark, was what separated good shooters from legends. The silence on the range was complete now, broken only by the whisper of wind through the trees and the distant sound of normal base operations continuing beyond our small drama. Even Jackson had stopped running his betting pool, too caught up in the tension to maintain his cynical commentary. I found that space between heartbeats where perfect shots lived, squeezed the trigger with the gentle pressure of someone who understood that greatness lives in the smallest details, and sent everything I was toward a target that most people couldn't even see. The shot echoed across Fort Bragg like thunder announcing the end of one story and the beginning of another. The bullet's flight time to a target 1,400 meters away is roughly 1.5 seconds, enough time for doubt to creep in, for wind to shift, for all the variables I'd calculated to prove wrong. But in that eternal moment between trigger pull and impact, I felt the same certainty Grandpa had taught me to find in the Arizona desert. When everything is perfect, you know it before the bullet arrives. Chief Patterson's voice cut through the silence like a blade through silk. Dead center. New Fort Bragg range record at 1,400 meters. The explosion of sound that followed was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. 60 people erupting simultaneously in disbelief, excitement, and the kind of primal recognition that comes when witnessing something genuinely extraordinary. But beneath the noise, I could see faces processing what had just happened and what it meant for everything they'd believed about who belonged in Special Forces. Connell Hayes was the first to recover her composure, stepping forward with the bearing of someone who'd just witnessed history being made. Miss Santos, that was the most impressive marksmanship demonstration I've seen in 25 years of military service. Her voice carried the authority of official recognition. Chief Patterson, please document everything for the formal record. Staff Sergeant Mitchell looked like a man who discovered that everything he thought he knew about leadership and judgment was wrong. His face had gone through several color changes as the implications of my performance sank in. Captain Morrison stood beside him, her status as the base's shooting champion evaporated like morning mist. But it was the reaction of my fellow SFAS candidates that cut deepest. Jackson, who'd been running betting pools on my failure, now couldn't meet my eyes. Thompson, who'd questioned my psychological fitness just hours earlier, was studying his boots with the intensity of someone reconsidering fundamental assumptions about competence and character. The silence that followed Connell Hayes' official recognition was different from anything I'd experienced during my time at Fort Bragg. Instead of the mocking, quiet, or dismissive whispers I'd grown accustomed to, this was the silence of people processing a complete reversal of expectations and trying to figure out what it meant for everything that had happened before. Dr. Hendricks appeared at the edge of the crowd, her clinical demeanor replaced by something approaching shock as she watched the candidate she'd recommended for psychological discharge demonstrate skills that defied every assumption she'd made about my capabilities and mental state. Miss Santos, Connell Hayes continued, her voice carrying clearly across the range. Military regulations require that any candidate who establishes a new range record during official testing be reconsidered for program selection, regardless of previous evaluation criteria. The words I'd been hoping to hear, but they felt different now. Not like salvation, but like vindication of everything I'd endured to reach this moment. However, she paused, studying my face with the intensity of someone trying to read character in features. I'm more interested in hearing what you want to do next. The question caught me off guard. After weeks of having my future decided by other people's opinions and assumptions, someone in authority was actually asking what I wanted. I looked around at the faces surrounding me. Instructors who'd dismissed me, candidates who'd mocked me, officers who'd written me off as a diversity experiment gone wrong. 3 weeks ago, being accepted into this program would have felt like the ultimate victory. But standing here with Grandpa's purple heart warm in my pocket and the echo of a perfect shot still ringing in my ears, I realized something had fundamentally changed. Colonel, I appreciate the opportunity for reconsideration, but I need to decline. The words hit the assembled crowd like a physical blow, causing several people to lean forward as if they hadn't heard correctly. Captain Morrison looked genuinely confused, as if the concept of turning down Special Forces selection didn't compute in her worldview. Ma'am, I continued, my voice growing stronger as the decision crystallized in my mind. I came here to prove that I belonged, but what I've learned is that the problem isn't whether I belong here. It's whether this system deserves people like me. Colonel Hayes's eyebrows rose slightly, but her expression remained professionally neutral. Explain. For 3 weeks, I've been systematically excluded, humiliated, and dismissed based on nothing more than appearance and assumptions. The same instructors who questioned my psychological fitness this morning are now ready to welcome me into the program because I can shoot better than anyone expected. I gestured toward the target at 1,400 meters. But my abilities haven't changed, only your perception of what I'm capable of. The range had grown completely quiet now, with everyone straining to hear words that were clearly building towards something significant. The military talks about finding warriors in unexpected places, but when someone unexpected actually shows up, the first instinct is to make them prove they're not a mistake rather than giving them the chance to prove they're exactly what you need. Staff Sergeant Mitchell stepped forward, his voice carrying a note of something that might have been desperation. Santos, you've made your point. Everyone here has learned something important about judging people prematurely, but walking away now would be a waste of extraordinary talent. I turned to face him directly, remembering every moment of casual cruelty and systematic dismissal I'd endured under his leadership. Sergeant, 3 hours ago you handed me discharge papers. The only thing that's changed is that I proved I was right and you were wrong. That's not growth. That's just embarrassment management. The accusation hung in the air like smoke, and I could see its impact in the way several instructors shifted uncomfortably. They weren't offering me a place in Special Forces because they'd recognized my worth. They were trying to avoid the embarrassment of having dismissed someone who just made military history. Chief Patterson stepped forward, her weathered face showing something that looked like pride mixed with understanding. Santos, what are you going to do instead? The question I'd been asking myself since realizing that proving I belonged wasn't the same as wanting to belong. I pulled out Grandpa's purple heart and held it up so everyone could see its tarnished surface catching the North Carolina sunlight. My grandfather earned this in Vietnam, then came home to people spitting on his uniform and calling him a baby killer. He could have been bitter, could have turned his back on service entirely. Instead, he taught his granddaughter that the most important battles aren't always fought for victory. Sometimes they're fought to prove that the fight was worth having. I looked around at the faces of people who'd spent weeks trying to break my spirit, seeing recognition beginning to dawn in some eyes while others remained locked in defensive confusion. I'm going to apply for a position as a civilian marksmanship instructor. Someone needs to train the next generation of people who don't look like what everyone expects a warrior to look like, but have the skills to excel if given the chance. Colonel Hayes nodded slowly, her expression shifting to something approaching respect. "Miss Santos, if you're serious about that path, I'd be willing to recommend you for the position personally." The offer was more than I dared hope for: official recognition, meaningful work, and the chance to change the system from the inside rather than just proving I could survive it. "Thank you, ma'am. I accept." As I walked away from the range that morning, I could hear conversations starting behind me, instructors questioning their own judgment, candidates reconsidering their assumptions, and senior officers discussing policy changes that might prevent future talent from being overlooked or dismissed. The real victory wasn't making the shot at 1,400 meters, though that would be remembered in Fort Bragg law for decades. The real victory was proving that excellence speaks louder than prejudice, and that sometimes the most important thing you can do is show others what's possible when someone refuses to accept limitations imposed by other people's expectations. 6 months later, I stood in front of the same advanced marksmanship range where I'd changed my life with a single shot. But this time I wore the instructor's uniform that had taken me from overlooked waitress to respected civilian contractor. The morning sun cast familiar shadows across Fort Bragg, but everything else had transformed in ways that rippled far beyond my personal story. The Rodriguez Protocol, named after my grandfather rather than me, at my insistence, had revolutionized military selection processes across all branches. Instead of evaluating candidates based on traditional profiles and conventional backgrounds, the new system prioritized core competencies and measurable skills over appearance, demographics, or social fit. The changes weren't just philosophical, they produced measurable results. Applications from non-traditional candidates had increased by 340% as people who'd never considered military service began to see themselves represented in recruitment materials that emphasized ability over conformity. More importantly, performance metrics showed that these unconventional recruits often outperformed their traditional counterparts in specialized skills that modern warfare demanded. My first class of instructor candidates reflected this new reality. 12 women and men from backgrounds that would have been automatically dismissed under the old system. Sarah Kim, a former video game designer whose understanding of complex systems translated perfectly to advanced ballistics calculations. Marcus Washington, a former ranch hand from Texas whose experience with long-distance shooting in varied conditions made him a natural sniper instructor. Jennifer Martinez, a former math teacher whose ability to break down complex concepts helped struggling students master fundamentals that had always been taught through intimidation rather than education. But the most satisfying changes were the ones I witnessed in the people who'd been part of my original nightmare at Fort Bragg. Staff Sergeant Mitchell had requested a transfer to another base immediately after my record-setting demonstration, unable to face the daily reminder of his professional failure. His replacement, Master Sergeant Patricia Rodriguez, no relation despite the name, brought 15 years of experience that included recognizing and developing talent regardless of its packaging. Captain Morrison's career had stalled completely after it became clear that her record-breaking marksmanship was the only exceptional thing about her leadership abilities. The investigation that followed my case revealed a pattern of discrimination and poor judgment that made her unsuitable for advancement. She'd been transferred to a logistics position where her personal biases couldn't impact the careers of other people who didn't fit her preconceptions about military excellence. Dr. Hendricks had faced the most professional scrutiny as her psychological evaluation of me became a case study in how personal bias could masquerade as clinical judgment. The review board didn't strip her of credentials, but she was required to undergo additional training in cultural competency and unconscious bias before being allowed to evaluate candidates again. The most profound change was in the culture itself, where casual mockery and systematic exclusion had once been accepted as normal parts of the selection process. Instructors now understood that their job was to identify and develop talent rather than enforce conformity to outdated stereotypes. Jackson, my former tormentor who'd run betting pools on my failure, had actually sought me out 2 months after I'd started my instructor position. He'd waited until after one of my advanced marksmanship classes, approaching with the hesitant manner of someone who knew they had amends to make. "Santos," he'd said, his voice lacking any of the arrogance I remembered. "I wanted to apologize for how I treated you during selection. I was wrong about everything, and I learned something important about myself that I didn't like." The apology had been genuine, carrying the weight of someone who'd spent months reconsidering fundamental assumptions about character and worth. He'd gone on to complete Special Forces training and specifically requested assignment to units with diverse team compositions, wanting to prove that his growth was more than just guilt management. Thompson had written me a letter that arrived 3 months after I'd started my new position. In it, he described how watching my performance had forced him to examine his own leadership style and recognize how his preconceptions had limited his effectiveness as both a soldier and a human being. He'd requested assignment to recruitment duties, wanting to help identify and encourage the kind of non-traditional candidates the military had been overlooking for decades. But the most meaningful validation came from an unexpected source: the steady stream of messages from young women who'd seen news coverage of my story and decided to pursue military careers they'd never considered possible. Maria Gutierrez from California wrote to tell me she'd enlisted in the Marines after watching video of my record-setting shot, determined to prove that excellence in technical fields wasn't limited to people who looked like traditional recruits. Ashley Johnson from Georgia had applied for Army Sniper School despite being told by her high school counselor that girls like her should focus on more realistic career paths. Destiny Williams from Detroit had scored highest in her class at Navy boot camp and credited my example with giving her the confidence to pursue advanced training in explosive ordnance disposal. Each letter reminded me that the real victory at Fort Bragg hadn't been proving I belonged in Special Forces. It had been proving that belonging isn't something other people get to decide for you based on their limited imagination about what excellence looks like. The range record I'd set stood unchallenged for exactly 4 months before being broken by one of my own students, Elena Vasquez, a former Texas ranch hand, who'd been dismissed from 3 different military recruitment offices before the Rodriguez Protocol gave her a chance to demonstrate skills that defied every assumption about her capabilities. Standing behind the spotting scope as Elena's bullet found its mark at 1,450 meters, I felt the same pride Grandpa must have experienced watching me exceed his own achievements. The cycle was continuing, each generation proving that greatness isn't inherited. It's developed through dedication, proper training, and the opportunity to show what you're truly capable of achieving. Chief Patterson, now nearing retirement, had become an unofficial mentor and the strongest advocate for expanding the Rodriguez Protocol beyond Fort Bragg to military installations worldwide. During our weekly coffee meetings, she'd share stories of other bases where traditional selection methods were being challenged by candidates who didn't fit conventional profiles but possessed exceptional abilities in core competencies. "You know what the most satisfying part is?" she'd asked during our last conversation before her retirement ceremony. "It's not that we're finding more qualified people. It's that we're finally admitting we were wrong about what qualified looks like." The ceremony honoring Chief Patterson's retirement had been held on the same range where I'd made the shot that changed everything. As she spoke about her 30 years of military service, she'd made a point of crediting my example with helping the military remember its founding principle: exceptional ability in any core competency matters more than conformity to traditional expectations. "The future of our military," she told the assembled crowd of instructors, candidates, and senior officers, "depends on our ability to recognize excellence, regardless of the package it comes in. Sometimes the most important battles are fought not against foreign enemies, but against our own assumptions about who deserves the chance to serve." As I stood in my instructor's uniform that morning, watching a new class of candidates begin their journey through a selection process that had been fundamentally changed by one perfect shot and the courage to demand recognition for demonstrating excellence, I pulled out Grandpa's Purple Heart and felt its familiar weight in my palm. The silver surface caught the North Carolina sunlight like a fragment of captured starlight, reflecting not just the past but the future. A future where young people from every background could see themselves represented in the military's vision of what a warrior could be. The harmonica melody drifted through my memory. Not Danny Boy this time, but something new and hopeful, carrying the promise that excellence has no single face, no required background, no predetermined path. Sometimes the most powerful victories aren't about conquering others. They're about refusing to let others define the limits of what's possible when someone dares to stand up and prove that greatness can come from anywhere if given the chance to shine. 3 years later, the Rodriguez Protocol had been adopted by every branch of the military, and the percentage of non-traditional candidates successfully completing advanced training programs had increased by over 200%. But more importantly, the culture had shifted in ways that couldn't be measured in statistics. From one that excluded based on assumptions to one that included based on demonstrated ability. And sometimes, late at night when the base was quiet and the range was empty, I'd stand where I'd once made an impossible shot and remember the girl from Arizona who'd refused to accept other people's definitions of what she could achieve. The echo of that perfect shot still rang across Fort Bragg, but it had become something bigger than personal vindication. It had become proof that courage doesn't always roar with the voice of authority, and that sometimes the most important thing you can do is show others what's possible when someone refuses to quit on their dreams. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our Everyday Life Stories community. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world.